The night my sister promised my marriage would collapse in a week, I thought she was just being cruel. 7 days later, I stood in front of a room full of guests, with proof that she had engineered its destruction from the very beginning. How did a single whisper at my engagement turn into a scandal that shattered my family in exactly 1 week? My name is Regina. I'm 27 years old, and I work as a licensed pharmacist in San Diego. I've always believed in structure, logic, and measurable truths. In my world, every prescription has a dosage, every diagnosis has evidence, and every reaction has a cause. But nothing in my medical training prepared me for the kind of poison that hides inside a family. I'm telling you this story because sometimes the most devastating betrayals don't begin with screaming or obvious hatred. Sometimes they begin with a smile, with a toast, with applause, with a whisper. My engagement party was held on a rooftop overlooking the city skyline. The evening air carried that perfect California warmth, soft enough to feel romantic but cool enough to keep the champagne crisp. String lights were woven through white roses, and the skyline glittered like it was celebrating with us. From the outside, it was the kind of event people post online with captions about fairy tales coming true. Daniel stood beside me, tall and confident in his tailored navy suit. He worked in real estate investments, the kind of man who could charm an entire room with a single handshake. He had ambition, polish, and the reassuring stability my parents adored. When he slipped the engagement ring onto my finger a few weeks earlier, I believed my life had aligned perfectly with the future I'd always imagined. Then Fiona arrived. My older sister had always known how to command attention without asking for it. She walked into the party wearing a sleek red dress that was just bold enough to make guests look twice. Her smile was radiant, almost theatrical. Growing up, she had always been the magnetic one, the beautiful one, the confident one, the daughter my parents subtly showcased. I had learned to live in the shadow without complaining. She hugged me tightly when she reached the stage, congratulated Daniel with polished enthusiasm, and raised her glass for a toast that made everyone laugh. She spoke about childhood memories, about how protective she had always been of me, about how happy she was to finally see Regina get her moment. Everyone clapped. I almost believed her. Later that night, as the music softened and guests moved toward the dessert tables, Fiona pulled me aside near the balcony railing. The city lights shimmered behind her like a dramatic backdrop. She reached for my hand, gently turning my ring under the light as if admiring the diamond. Then she leaned close enough that I could feel her breath brush against my ear. "Trust me," she whispered softly, almost affectionately. "This marriage will only last 1 week." She pulled back with a small smile. Not a wild, jealous grin. Not a dramatic sneer. Just calm certainty. For a second, I thought I misheard her. I let out an awkward laugh. "What?" She tilted her head slightly. "Relax. I'm joking. You know I love you." But her eyes didn't match her tone. There was no teasing sparkle. No warmth. Only calculation. Before I could respond, Daniel appeared beside us, asking if everything was all right. Fiona's expression shifted instantly back into charm. "Of course," she said smoothly. "I was just telling Regina how lucky she is." Daniel forced a smile. And that was the moment the seed of doubt planted itself inside me. Because he didn't look amused. He looked tense. You see, Daniel was rarely unsettled. He negotiated million-dollar deals without blinking. He navigated high-pressure meetings effortlessly. But standing next to Fiona, his shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. His jaw tightened. His hand slipped around my waist, not protectively, but cautiously. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking it. Fiona had always been dramatic. Growing up, she thrived on intensity. She competed in everything: grades, appearance, attention. If I scored well on an exam, she had already scored higher. If I received praise, she found a way to redirect it. It wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was subtle. But it was constant. Our parents didn't mean harm. At least, I don't think they did. They simply grew accustomed to Fiona's fire. They excused her sharp comments as strong personality. They dismissed her boundary crossing as passion. I learned to stay quiet. But something about that whisper didn't feel like sibling rivalry. It felt like foreknowledge. The rest of the engagement party moved forward flawlessly. Guests toasted our future. My mother wiped emotional tears. My father proudly introduced Daniel to business associates. Fiona laughed louder than anyone else, floating through the crowd like she owned the celebration. If someone had taken a photograph of us that night, you would see a perfect family framed against the skyline. What you wouldn't see is the crack that had already formed beneath the surface. When the evening ended and Daniel and I drove home, I asked casually, "Did Fiona seem strange to you tonight?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Fiona is always intense." "That's not what I meant." He hesitated just slightly. "Let's not let her ruin this. It's our moment." Our moment. I nodded and let it go. Because I wanted to believe in happiness more than I wanted to investigate discomfort. Looking back now, that was my mistake. The whisper was not random. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't a careless joke. It was a countdown. But on that rooftop, with city lights glittering around us and champagne still warm in my blood, I couldn't imagine that 7 days later, my marriage would indeed collapse, not because of fate, not because of incompatibility, but because of a plan that had already been set in motion before I even said yes. If you're wondering why I didn't confront her right then, why I didn't push harder, why I ignored the tension in Daniel's face, the answer is simple. We are conditioned to protect the illusion of family. We minimize red flags when they come from blood. We tell ourselves we're imagining things. I did all of that. And that is how my story truly began, not at the altar, not at the scandal, not at the courtroom. It began with a whisper I chose not to believe. If I had understood what that whisper meant, would I have walked away before the wedding? Or was it always necessary for everything to fall apart before I could finally see the truth? Stay with me, because what happened next was not an accident. It was a carefully constructed collapse. And it unfolded exactly 1 week later. 2 days after our wedding, the house felt colder than it should have. Our suitcases were still standing in the hallway, perfectly packed for the honeymoon we were supposed to be on. The tags still hung from the handles. The flight confirmations were still sitting in my inbox. Hawaii was waiting for us, warm sand, ocean air, the beginning of everything we had promised each other. Instead, I was standing in our living room, staring at unopened luggage while Daniel paced near the window with his phone pressed tightly to his ear. When he finally hung up, he didn't look at me. "I have to cancel the trip," he said, too quickly. "There's volatility in the market. A client issue. I can't leave right now." His explanation sounded professional, reasonable, almost rehearsed. But his hands were trembling. The air conditioning was set low, yet there was sweat forming at his hairline. Daniel was the type of man who thrived under pressure. I had seen him handle complex negotiations without a flicker of anxiety. But this was different. This wasn't stress. It was fear. I wanted to believe him. I truly did. I told myself that successful men sometimes face sudden crises, that marriage meant flexibility, that supporting your partner sometimes meant sacrificing your own plans. So I nodded. "Okay," I said softly. "We can reschedule." But something inside me had started calculating. That afternoon, I decided to log into our joint account. There were still a few vendor balances from the wedding reception I wanted to clear. I sat at the dining table with my laptop open, sunlight cutting across the polished wood surface, and entered the password we had created together. When the account loaded, I felt my stomach drop. $20,000 was gone, not transferred to savings, not paid toward a vendor, not documented with a notification, just gone. I refreshed the page. I checked the transaction history. There it was, a withdrawal processed electronically 2 days earlier. The day after our wedding, my heart began pounding in my ears. I wasn't panicking yet. I was analyzing. That's what I do. I'm a pharmacist. I assess symptoms before reacting. But this wasn't a miscalculation. It was deliberate. When Daniel came downstairs later that evening, I turned the laptop toward him without saying a word. His eyes scanned the screen, his face drained of color. "Oh," he muttered, swallowing hard. That? I repeated calmly. "Daniel, where did $20,000 go?" He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I had never seen before. A friend needed help. It was urgent. His company was collapsing. I didn't have time to explain. What friend? You don't know him. That was the first real crack. I knew most of Daniel's associates. Real estate investors talk constantly. Deals, partnerships, networks, it's a small circle. If someone needed $20,000 urgently, I would have at least heard the name in passing. Then tell me now, I said quietly. He looked away. It's complicated. Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. For the first time since the wedding, I felt like I was sitting across from a stranger. I didn't scream. I didn't accuse. I simply closed the laptop. Next time, I said evenly, we make financial decisions together. He nodded quickly, almost gratefully, as if relieved that I wasn't pushing further. That should have comforted me. Instead, it confirmed that he expected me not to push. That night, I barely slept. The house felt unfamiliar, like I had moved into someone else's life. I kept replaying Fiona's whisper at the engagement party. 1 week. It had only been 2 days. On the third evening after the wedding, the electronic lock on our front door beeped unexpectedly. Daniel stiffened. Before either of us could react, the door swung open. Fiona walked in. She didn't knock. She didn't call. She carried plastic containers of food as if she were doing us a favor, but her expression was not warm. It was assessing. "Oh, good," she said casually, stepping inside. "You're both home." I remained seated on the couch, stunned. "Fiona, what are you doing here?" She ignored my question and walked straight into the kitchen. "I brought dinner. You look tired, Daniel." The way she said his name made something twist inside me. Then she turned toward him and said, without hesitation, "Get me a glass of water." It wasn't a request. It was a command, and Daniel obeyed. Immediately. No hesitation, no glance in my direction, no explanation. He moved quickly, almost automatically, filling a glass from the filter and placing it into her hand with visible tension in his shoulders. I watched the exchange in silence, my pulse steady but my mind racing. This wasn't sibling familiarity. This wasn't comfort. This was hierarchy. Fiona took the water, her eyes locked on his. She smiled faintly, not affectionately, but knowingly. "Good," she murmured. "You're learning." "Learning what?" Daniel returned to the couch and sat down, avoiding my gaze. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I had grown up with Fiona. I knew her moods, her tactics, her subtle manipulations. She enjoyed control. She enjoyed seeing people bend. But I had never seen Daniel bend before. "Why are you here?" I asked again, forcing my voice to remain neutral. She waved dismissively. "I was nearby. Thought I'd check on you, make sure my sister is being treated properly." The irony of that statement almost made me laugh. Instead, I observed. Daniel barely spoke while she was there. When she did speak, he reacted like someone anticipating impact. Every movement of hers seemed to hold weight. After about 40 minutes, she stood to leave. As she reached the door, she paused beside Daniel and leaned in slightly close enough that I couldn't hear what she whispered. But I saw his jaw tighten. When the door finally closed behind her, the silence was unbearable. "What is going on?" I asked softly. "Nothing," he snapped too quickly. "You're overthinking." I held his gaze. "No," I said quietly. "I'm not." For a long moment, he looked like he might say something, like he might confess whatever was trapped behind his fear. But he didn't. He walked upstairs instead. That was the moment I stopped assuming this was simple marital tension. This was not about a canceled honeymoon. This was not about a financial misunderstanding. This was about leverage. The way Fiona moved through my home not as a guest, but as an authority, told me everything I needed to know. Something bound Daniel to her. And it wasn't affection. It was something heavier. Something dangerous. As I stood alone in the living room, staring at the untouched suitcases in the hallway, I realized that Fiona's whisper had not been theatrical jealousy. It had been confidence. And confidence only comes from certainty. Whatever she knew, whatever she held over him, had already begun unraveling my marriage before I even had time to understand the rules of the game. It was only day 3. 4 more days until her prediction would either collapse or come true. By the fourth night of my marriage, the tension had become something physical like humidity before a storm. You can't see it, but you feel it pressing against your lungs. My parents insisted on hosting a family dinner. My mother said it would ease the awkwardness from the wedding week. My father claimed it would give Daniel a chance to relax. Fiona had suggested it, of course. She framed it as a gesture of unity. Unity. That word almost makes me laugh now. The dining table was set with polished silverware and the expensive porcelain my mother only brought out for holidays. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic filled the air. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Daniel sat across from Fiona. He hadn't touched his wine. He never did, not because he didn't enjoy it, but because he physically couldn't. Daniel had a severe alcohol allergy. Even a sip would cause hives and shortness of breath. He carried an emergency injection pen everywhere. It was one of the first things I learned about him when we started dating, which is why what happened next still echoes in my mind like a gunshot. Dinner conversation felt strained from the beginning. My father attempted small talk about property values and market fluctuations. Daniel answered politely, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Fiona, meanwhile, barely ate. She watched him, not casually, intently. At one point, she leaned back in her chair and said, "It's important for a man to take responsibility for his mistakes. Don't you agree, Daniel?" The fork slipped slightly in his hand. "Yes," he replied quietly. My mother shot Fiona a warning glance, but Fiona ignored it. She had always known how to dominate a room without raising her voice. I sat still, observing. I had stopped reacting emotionally days ago. Instead, I listened, measured, calculated, and then she stood up. Slowly, deliberately. She placed one hand over her stomach, flat, elegant, theatrical, and looked around the table to ensure she had everyone's full attention. "I have something to share," she said calmly. My pulse slowed instead of quickened. When you sense impact coming, your body sometimes prepares in strange ways. "I'm 3 months pregnant." The words hung in the air. My mother gasped softly. My father straightened in his chair. I felt nothing at first, just stillness. Then Fiona turned her gaze toward Daniel. "And the father has promised to take responsibility, haven't you?" The metallic clatter of his fork, hitting the plate, sliced through the silence. He didn't look at me. He stared at the table. "I'm sorry," he muttered, voice breaking. "It was a mistake, before the wedding. I was drunk. I didn't know what I was doing." For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. "Drunk." The word rang in my ears. I slowly turned my head toward him. Daniel does not drink. He cannot drink. Not socially, not casually, not ever. The allergy is immediate and severe. And yet he had just confessed in front of my entire family to being drunk enough to sleep with my sister. It was not just betrayal. It was a biological impossibility. My mother began crying softly, pressing her napkin to her mouth. My father's face darkened with disappointment. But neither of them questioned the details. They were focused on damage control. "Regina," my mother whispered, reaching across the table for my hand. "We can get through this. For the baby. For the family." For the baby. For the family. Not for me. Not for truth. I looked at Fiona. She was calm, almost serene. There was no guilt in her expression. No fear of consequences. Only control. Daniel's shoulders were shaking slightly, but he did not look at her either. He looked trapped. And that's when something shifted inside me. Not heartbreak. Clarity. If he were truly guilty, if this were a drunken mistake, there would be shame, chaotic, messy, human shame. But what I saw was fear, the kind of fear that comes from being cornered. I gently pulled my hand away from my mother's grip. "I need some air," I said quietly. No one stopped me. Outside, the night air felt colder than it should have. I stood on the front lawn, staring at the dark sky, replaying every detail of the past week. The missing $20,000. The canceled honeymoon. Fiona's uninvited visits. Daniel's obedience. Now this confession. It wasn't adding up emotionally, it was adding up strategically. When I returned inside, Daniel avoided my eyes. Fiona watched me carefully, as if assessing whether I would explode or collapse. I did neither. I sat down. "If this is true," I said calmly, "then we'll handle it responsibly. But I want all facts verified." Fiona's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean," I replied evenly, "this situation affects everyone. It deserves clarity." Daniel swallowed hard. Dinner ended awkwardly. My parents avoided confrontation. Fiona left early, claiming she wasn't feeling well. Daniel and I drove home in silence. Halfway there, I finally spoke. "You said you were drunk." He nodded weakly. "You know that's impossible." He didn't answer. His silence confirmed everything. When we reached the house, he went straight upstairs without another word. I didn't follow. Instead, I sat in the dark living room and made a phone call. My best friend, Maya, is a senior corporate attorney. Calm, precise, brilliant. If there was one person I trusted to approach this logically, it was her. When she answered, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. "I need you to run a discreet background check on Daniel's firm," I said quietly. "Something is wrong." There was a pause. "What kind of wrong?" "Financial wrong." She didn't ask for more explanation. "Give me until morning." That night, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing Fiona's voice. 1 week. The next morning, Maya called back. "There's an internal audit underway at his company," she said. "A $50,000 escrow deposit is unaccounted for." Daniel was supervising the transaction. The world did not collapse when she said it. It sharpened. Suddenly, everything aligned. If Daniel had mishandled, or worse, misappropriated funds, he would be vulnerable, desperate. And Fiona, who had always been observant, would know exactly how to exploit that vulnerability. A false pregnancy, a forced confession, a financial leash, blackmail. It wasn't about love. It wasn't about jealousy. It was leverage. I hung up the phone and sat very still. My sister hadn't predicted the end of my marriage. She had engineered it. And Daniel hadn't betrayed me out of passion. He had betrayed me out of fear. By the end of that 4th day, I no longer felt like a newlywed. I felt like an investigator, and I knew one thing with certainty. If Fiona believed I would crumble under humiliation, she didn't know me at all. By the 5th morning of my marriage, I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. There is a difference between heartbreak and strategy. Heartbreak makes you loud. Strategy makes you quiet. I chose quiet. Instead of going to work at the pharmacy, I drove downtown to the financial district, where Daniel's office tower pierced the gray San Diego sky like a monument to ambition. I had been there before holiday parties, networking events, polite smiles exchanged with colleagues. But that morning, the glass exterior looked less like success and more like a mirror reflecting deception. I walked through the revolving doors with steady composure. No tears, no accusations, just observation. The receptionist recognized me immediately. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," she said politely. "Good morning," I replied with the same calm tone I use when counseling patients about side effects. I didn't ask for Daniel. I didn't need to. As I moved toward the accounting wing, I slowed my steps near a partially open breakroom door. 2 senior accountants were speaking in hushed voices, unaware of my presence. "50,000 missing from escrow," one whispered. "The audit committee is escalating it. If this traces back to him." Their voices trailed off, but I didn't need to hear the rest. The missing $50,000 was real. This wasn't rumor. It wasn't misunderstanding. It was a liability. I walked out of that building with confirmation of what Maya had already told me. Daniel was under internal investigation. And if the company chose to pursue charges, his career, his reputation, everything would collapse. Suddenly, Fiona's behavior made terrifying sense. She hadn't randomly decided to destroy my marriage. She had discovered Daniel's vulnerability, and she had weaponized it. That afternoon, instead of confronting either of them, I contacted Maya again. We agreed on one rule. Everything would be handled legally. No breaking into devices, no stealing documents, no dramatic vigilante acts. If Fiona and Daniel were operating through intimidation and deception, I would operate through evidence and law. Maya connected me with a licensed private investigator, discreet, professional, meticulous. Within hours, surveillance began. I didn't follow Fiona myself. I didn't sneak into garages or collect hair samples the way anger might tempt someone to do. I understood that anything obtained illegally could be dismissed in court, and I was no longer thinking emotionally. I was thinking ahead. By the evening of the fifth day, the investigator called with his first update. Your sister has been meeting regularly with a man named Ryan, he explained. Auto mechanic. Small repair shop outside city limits. Frequency? I asked. 3 visits in the last week alone. Close proximity. Physical familiarity. I closed my eyes briefly. Keep documenting. The next day, the investigator provided photos. Clear, time-stamped. Fiona, arriving at the shop. Fiona leaving nearly an hour later. Ryan standing close, his hand resting on her lower back in a way that was not ambiguous. Then came something more. Cash exchanges. Large white envelopes. My stomach tightened, but my voice remained steady. Continue. Meanwhile, Maya initiated formal steps to preserve potential evidence. Daniel's company, already conducting an audit, was required to maintain electronic communication records. We did not hack his laptop. We did not break passwords. Instead, we prepared for what would inevitably surface once legal proceedings began. That evening, Daniel barely spoke during dinner. His phone buzzed repeatedly, and each time it did, he flinched. Who keeps messaging you? I asked lightly. Work, he muttered. I nodded, pretending to accept it. But inside, the pattern was becoming clear. On the 6th morning, the investigator delivered what I had been waiting for. Ryan was not just meeting Fiona. He was living with her part-time. Witnesses at the repair shop confirmed it. Neighbors had seen her car parked overnight multiple times before my wedding. Multiple times. That meant the affair, if you could call it that, had begun long before the engagement whisper. Fiona hadn't impulsively become pregnant after a mistake. She had been in a relationship. The pregnancy announcement had been strategic timing. The final piece came through voluntary compliance. Through legal counsel, Maya's firm issued formal notice requesting confirmation of paternity, given the public claim Fiona had made at the family dinner. Under pressure and perhaps believing Daniel would continue cooperating, Fiona agreed to submit to a private, certified DNA test. Ryan did as well. Daniel, cornered by his own lie, had no choice. The waiting period for results felt longer than the entire week preceding it. During those hours, I watched Daniel move through our house like a man pacing a prison cell. He barely ate. He avoided my gaze. Once, I heard him whispering into his phone late at night, voice shaking. Just give me time, he said. Please. I didn't need to hear the other side to know who he was speaking to. Fiona. On the afternoon of the 6th day, the email arrived. I opened it alone in my home office. The laboratory report was clinical, unemotional, precise. Probability of paternity, 99.9% Ryan. Probability of paternity, 0% Daniel excluded. There it was. Scientific truth. I didn't feel triumph. I felt confirmation. Fiona had forced Daniel to claim responsibility for a child that was not his. She had leveraged his financial misconduct to secure compliance, and in doing so, she had attempted to bind my marriage to her deception. I printed the report. Then I reviewed the investigator's documentation, photographs, timestamps, witness statements. Then I reviewed the audit memo from Daniel's firm, which had now escalated the missing $50,000 deposit to formal internal review. The web was complete. Fiona had discovered Daniel's financial misconduct. She had threatened exposure. In exchange for silence, she demanded money both from our joint account and from his professional access. And to secure long-term leverage, she staged a pregnancy scandal, forcing him into public confession. It was not impulsive cruelty. It was calculated extortion. That evening, Fiona called me directly for the first time in days. "How are you holding up?" she asked sweetly. "I'm fine," I replied evenly. "Good. I know this is difficult, but families survive worse." I almost admired her composure. "You were right," I said softly. "About what?" "The 1-week prediction," she laughed lightly. "Sometimes I just know things." "Yes," I said calmly. "You do." When I hung up, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. Instead, I began planning something precise. The seventh day, exactly 1 week after the wedding, happened to coincide with Fiona's birthday celebration, a lavish gathering she had insisted on hosting at my parents' villa. She believed it would solidify her narrative. Pregnant, forgiven, supported. She believed I would attend quietly. She believed Daniel would remain silent. She believed the lie was secure. What she didn't know was that truth does not need volume. It needs timing. As I organized the documents neatly into a folder, I realized something profound. Fiona's greatest mistake was not the affair. It was underestimating me. She thought I would respond emotionally. She thought humiliation would paralyze me. She thought family loyalty would silence me. Instead, she gave me 7 days. 7 days to gather evidence. 7 days to understand the leverage. 7 days to dismantle everything she built. When I closed the folder and placed it into my desk drawer, I finally allowed myself one deep breath. Tomorrow would be her birthday. And the end of my marriage, exactly as she had promised. Exactly 1 week after my wedding, my parents' villa was glowing again. Crystal chandeliers shimmered against polished marble floors. White orchids lined the staircase. A string quartet played near the balcony doors, their music soft and elegant, as if this were just another celebration in a family that had always valued appearances over truth. Officially, it was Fiona's birthday. Unofficially, it was the final act of her performance. Guests arrived, dressed in tailored suits and silk dresses. Champagne flowed freely, laughter echoed through the hall. If anyone sensed tension beneath the surface, they hid it well. My mother moved through the crowd, greeting relatives with a strained smile. My father stood near the bar, pretending normalcy. Fiona entered the room like royalty. She wore a fitted ivory dress that subtly emphasized her stomach, still barely visible, but deliberately highlighted. Her hand rested there often, a theatrical gesture she had perfected in just a few days. Daniel followed half a step behind her, pale, exhausted, compliant. If you didn't know the truth, you might have believed they were the center of a complicated but united family. I stood near the staircase, watching, calm, measured. I had spent the afternoon reviewing every document one last time. DNA results, investigator photographs, audit confirmation, preserved communications secured through legal channels. Everything organized chronologically, everything undeniable. I wasn't there to scream. I was there to present. Around 7:45, Fiona approached me with a glass of sparkling water. "I'm glad you came," she said sweetly. "It means a lot." "Of course," I replied with a small smile. "Family matters." Her eyes flickered, just slightly. At exactly 8 o'clock, I nodded to the event coordinator. The quartet softened their music. The lights dimmed slightly. Conversations quieted as Fiona stepped forward, clearly expecting to deliver a birthday speech. But I moved first. I took the microphone from the stand gently, as if it were part of the plan all along. "For those of you who don't know me well," I began calmly, my voice steady and clear, "my name is Regina. I got married exactly 1 week ago." Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. "And at my engagement party," I continued, turning my gaze directly toward Fiona. My sister leaned close and whispered something to me. She said, "Trust me, this marriage will only last 1 week." Murmurs spread. Fiona's smile froze. "You were right," I said evenly. "Today is day 7. Silence settled over the room. Behind me, the large projection screen that had been prepared for birthday photos flickered to life. The first image appeared. The certified DNA report. I didn't need dramatic music. I didn't need theatrics. "Earlier this week," I said calmly, "a claim was made publicly that my husband was the father of my sister's child." The summary section of the report was enlarged on the screen. "According to certified laboratory testing, that claim is false." A wave of whispers moved through the guests. "Probability of paternity, 99.9% Ryan Matthews," I read aloud. "Daniel Carter excluded." Fiona took a step forward. "Regina, stop this." But I didn't stop. The next slide appeared, time-stamped photographs from the investigator. Fiona entering the auto repair shop. Fiona leaving hours later. Ryan's hand resting possessively at her waist. This is not about shame, I said softly. It is about truth. Gasps echoed near the back of the room. Daniel remained frozen beside the bar, his face ashen. And finally, I continued. This week I learned that Daniel's firm has been conducting an internal audit regarding a missing escrow deposit. The slide changed again, this time showing a formal notice from the firm confirming investigation status. Fiona discovered this information, I said steadily, and used it. A final slide appeared documentation of financial transfers, corroborated by the audit timeline and the withdrawal from our joint account. She threatened exposure, I said, in exchange for money. And in order to secure long-term leverage, she staged a pregnancy scandal and forced a confession. Fiona's composure cracked. You have no right. I have every right, I replied calmly. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't trembling. I was simply stating facts. Guests began stepping back from Fiona instinctively. Conversations turned sharp and fragmented. One of my aunts whispered loudly, "Is this extortion?" Another guest pulled out his phone, unsure whether to record or hide. At that moment, the front doors of the villa opened. Two uniformed officers entered, followed by a detective in plain clothes. There was no dramatic shouting, no chaos, just procedure. Earlier that afternoon, Maya had formally submitted documentation to authorities regarding potential financial misconduct and coercion. Tonight's event simply accelerated the inevitable. The detective approached Daniel first. "Mr. Carter, we need to speak with you regarding your company's audit." Daniel didn't resist. He didn't argue. He simply nodded weakly. Then the detective turned toward Fiona. "Miss Carter, we also need to discuss allegations of extortion and financial coercion." The room felt suspended in time. Fiona looked at me, not with hatred, not with rage, but with disbelief. "You did this," she whispered. "No," I replied softly. "You did." Ryan entered moments later, having received a message earlier that evening about payment. His arrival only deepened the silence. When he realized the situation unfolding before him, his confusion turned quickly into anger. "You said tonight," he snapped at Fiona. The detective intervened before voices could rise further. Within minutes, both Fiona and Daniel were escorted outside for questioning. The flashing lights from the patrol cars reflected off the villa's pristine white walls, distorting the elegant atmosphere into something almost surreal. Guests stood in clusters, whispering in disbelief. My parents remained in the center of the room, stunned. My mother approached me slowly. "Regina," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "Why couldn't you handle this privately?" I looked at her gently. "It was never handled privately when it involved me." She had no answer. As the villa emptied and the musicians packed their instruments quietly, I stood alone near the projection screen, watching the final slide fade to black. Exactly 1 week. Fiona had predicted the end of my marriage. What she hadn't predicted was the exposure of her own deception. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. When I walked outside, the night air felt different from the one at my engagement party. Less romantic, more honest. Daniel was seated in the back of a patrol vehicle, speaking with the detective. He glanced at me briefly, shame heavy in his eyes. For the first time all week, I saw something other than fear. I saw acceptance. Fiona stood a few feet away, arguing softly with another officer, but even she knew the performance was over. 7 days. That was all it took for illusion to collapse. As I stepped down the villa stairs, the sound of the front doors closing behind me echoed through the night. My marriage had ended, not in tears, not in rage, but in truth. 1 month after the birthday party that ended my marriage, I found myself sitting in a courtroom that felt far colder than the marble floors of my parents' villa ever had. There is something about courtrooms that strips drama away. No chandeliers, no music, no applause, just wood benches, fluorescent lights, and consequences spoken in measured tones. Fiona stood a few feet ahead of me, no longer dressed in silk or designer heels. The tailored dresses were gone. The confident posture had softened. She wore a simple, muted outfit, her hair pulled back tightly as if discipline could replace control. For the first time in my life, she looked small. Daniel sat on the opposite side of the aisle, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floor. The man who once negotiated property deals with ease now looked like someone negotiating with regret. The legal process moved forward quickly because the evidence was clear. The internal audit from Daniel's firm confirmed the missing escrow funds. Though he avoided federal charges by cooperating and agreeing to restitution, his professional licenses were permanently revoked. His career, the foundation of his identity, dissolved in weeks. Fiona's case unfolded differently. The documented financial transfers, the corroborated communications, and the timing of her demands established a pattern of coercion. While her defense attempted to frame the situation as a family misunderstanding, the evidence told a cleaner story. Extortion does not become harmless simply because it happens within bloodlines. When the judge read the sentencing decision, the room remained silent. There was no dramatic gasp, just the steady cadence of accountability. Fiona received a multi-year sentence for financial coercion and fraud-related offenses. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't cinematic. It was final. I watched her face as the words settled. For a brief moment, her eyes flickered toward me, not angry, not pleading, just stunned. Daniel's outcome was humiliating rather than incarcerating. Public disciplinary actions stripped him of the career he had built for over a decade. His reputation in the business community collapsed almost overnight. Investors withdrew. Colleagues distanced themselves. The social circle that once praised him turned silent. I saw him weeks later by accident. I was driving past a construction site when I noticed a familiar posture among the workers unloading materials. He looked thinner, sunburned, uncertain. When he saw me, he didn't approach. He simply nodded. It wasn't hatred I felt. It was distance. But the legal consequences were only part of the fallout. The deeper fracture ran through my family. My parents aged in those weeks, not physically overnight, but emotionally. My mother's voice lost its confidence. My father's shoulders seemed permanently lowered. They came to my apartment one evening, carrying a box of old photo albums, as if nostalgia could mend what had collapsed. My mother cried openly. "We just wanted peace," she whispered. "We didn't want a public scandal." I listened quietly. Peace. That word again. For years, I said gently. Peace meant ignoring her behavior. Peace meant minimizing my discomfort. Peace meant asking me to tolerate what was unfair. My father's eyes filled with something I had rarely seen from him, remorse. "We thought she would grow out of it," he said softly. I nodded. But she grew into it. It wasn't cruelty that I felt toward my parents. It was clarity. Their silence had created the environment where Fiona learned she could manipulate without consequence. Their favoritism had taught her that boundaries were flexible. "I don't hate you," I told them honestly, "but I can't return to the same dynamic." That night, when they left my apartment, it felt like closing a chapter I had spent my entire life trying to keep open. Meanwhile, I finalized my divorce. The legal process was clinical and swift. With documented evidence of financial misconduct and emotional coercion, the settlement favored separation without complication. I retained ownership of the house, but I chose to sell it. Every room carried memory, not just of betrayal, but of illusion. When I handed the keys to the new owners, I felt something surprising: lightness. The proceeds from the sale, combined with my own savings, gave me the opportunity I had postponed for years. Before Daniel, before engagement parties and rooftop lights, I had dreamed of opening my own independent pharmacy, a place where patient care mattered more than corporate margins. I signed the lease on a modest but bright storefront in the heart of the city. The first morning I unlocked the door. Sunlight poured through the windows and stretched across the empty shelves. It smelled like fresh paint and possibility. There were no whispers here, no manipulation, no hierarchy, just work. Honest work. Building something from the ground up requires patience, the kind that heartbreak unexpectedly strengthens. As customers began coming in, as prescriptions were filled and consultations given, I felt something I hadn't realized I had been missing. Control. Not control over people. Control over my own direction. Occasionally, people would ask about the wedding, about the divorce, about the scandal that had briefly circulated in social circles. I answered simply. It lasted 1 week. Some would look at me with pity, but I never felt pitied. Fiona had whispered that my marriage would only last 7 days. She intended it as a curse. But in a strange way, it became a gift. If the deception had lasted months, years, I might have lost more than money. I might have lost confidence, identity, time. Instead, the truth surfaced quickly, painfully, but quickly. One evening, after closing the pharmacy, I stood behind the counter and reflected on everything that had unfolded. Betrayal, exposure, courtrooms, separation, and I realized something deeper. Revenge was never the goal. Clarity was. I did not orchestrate chaos. I revealed facts. I did not destroy my sister. She dismantled herself when she believed I would remain silent. And Daniel's downfall did not come from my anger. It came from his fear-driven decisions long before I discovered them. The greatest lesson I learned wasn't about trust. It was about independence. Financial independence gave me options. Emotional independence gave me strength. And moral independence allowed me to act without becoming what I was fighting against. If I had depended entirely on Daniel's income, I might have hesitated to expose him. If I had depended entirely on my parents' approval, I might have accepted Fiona's manipulation. But I didn't. Standing alone is frightening until you realize it means you are no longer controlled. Today, my life is quieter. No grand parties. No rooftop celebrations. Just routine, stability, self-respect. Sometimes I still hear that whisper in memory. This marriage will only last 1 week. And I smile. Because she was right. It did. And that week was enough to teach me more about strength than years of comfort ever could. Some people believe revenge means destruction. I believe it means restoration, restoring your boundaries, restoring your truth, restoring your future. And sometimes, the most powerful response to betrayal is not rage, but rebuilding something better in its place. When I look back at everything that happened in just 7 days, I realize this story was never simply about a failed marriage. It was about manipulation hidden behind family loyalty. It was about fear disguised as love. And most importantly, it was about the quiet strength it takes to stand up for yourself when everyone expects you to stay silent. This video is not meant to glorify revenge. It's meant to show that truth, when handled with patience and clarity, is more powerful than anger. Fiona believed control would protect her. Daniel believed silence would save him. But in the end, evidence and integrity spoke louder than either of them. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated, manipulated, or pressured to keep the peace at the expense of your own dignity, know that you are not alone. Sometimes, the collapse of something painful is the beginning of something stronger. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. If you enjoy deep, emotional storytelling about betrayal, justice, and personal growth, please subscribe to Revenge Tale Network. There are many more stories waiting to be told, and sometimes the next one might feel a little too close to home.